Hello and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Ed McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today on the show, we're talking about neighbours at war, why you need to get on with your neighbours, and then what happens if, unfortunately, you don't end up getting on, and then what do you do in that situation? Now, we've got some great stories for you, but before we get into that, let's talk about the 7 reasons why, as a property investor, you actually do need your neighbours' help in some instances.
Well, firstly, we're going to cover off cross leases. So remember, with a cross lease, you own a part share in a shared amount of land. So it might be a half share in a 900 square metre section. And if you want to make any changes to the flats plan, you have to have your neighbours' consent. Now, if your neighbours don't like you, they can just say no. And or if you're in breach of your flats plan, they can ask you to remedy it at any time. So it can be quite a challenge. So if you're in a cross lease situation, very, very important that you get on with your neighbours.
Next up is body corporates. So let's say you've got a body corporate of, say, 16 owners within that block, and you're trying to get something through the body corporate. Well, you might need your neighbours and a whole heap of them to agree with you. You've got to convince them to your way of thinking so you're able to get whatever you need through the body corporate agreed upon. What's number 3, Andrew?
Number 3 is resource consents. Now, if you're wanting to do a development on your site, you might find that you're in breach of the recession plan, and this can require neighbours' consent. So I'll give you an example. Number 321 Wilson's Road, I've just been working on maybe doing a development there. And I looked at putting 5 units on there. And to get 5 units, I'd have to build up. And to build up, I'd have to impose on the recession plane of my neighbour, Kevin.
Now, just to explain what a recession plane is for everybody at home.
Basically, that's the angle in which you can see the rest of the rest of the world, I guess, is the best way of putting it. So if Kevin next door is sitting in his house and he wants to look up at the sky and he sees a great big building in front of it, then it's cutting in on his view. So in order to get this passed, I've got to go and have a chat to him. Lucky Kevin likes me. I lived next door to him for a number of years as a kid. There is a story years and years ago.
He still likes you.
Here's a neighbours at war story. Years and years ago, Mum came home from work and she brought Josh, my brother, and I into the lounge and said, "Did you throw eggs at Kevin's house today?" Now, we tried to deny it as much as we could, but unfortunately, given our house backed onto his house and there was no other way that someone would come off the street and manage to get him at that trajectory, we had to then go and apologise to Kevin Dickinson. And he still brings it up every time I go and see him.
What did Kevin do to make you throw eggs at his house? That's the real question.
It's a very good question. He asked me that and the answer was nothing at all.
And so you may need your neighbour's approval in order to have a resource consent. Number 4 is the replacement of joint assets. So you and your neighbour probably share a fence. Depending on where their house is relative to yours, you might also share a bit of a driveway. Maybe you have a bit of a common garden, a wee strip of grass in that instance. And if you want to replace or upgrade any of that, again, you're probably going to be sharing some of those costs with your neighbour. And so you want to get on with them, because if you want to replace the fence and your neighbour doesn't, got a story about that in a moment, then they may not want to pay out some of that money to upgrade your fence, in which case you want to get on with them so that you can agree with them.
Next one is extra pair of eyes on your house. And this applies if you're owner-occupied or if you're an investor. So again, going back to Wilson's Road, Kevin Dickinson has always rung me and told me if there's an issue. So if the neighbours are having a few parties and, they're well within their rights to have a party, but then I kind of want to know what's going on, and the property manager's never going to be able to pick this up unless it's, involving holes to the walls. So he'll let me know, hey, they're having another party again. They've been having quite a few people stay over. And so it's always quite useful to have that on the ground information coming from your neighbour.
And then looking at it from the other side as well, I want to talk about noises. So you might want to get on with your neighbour if you're living within the property, so that if you are going to have a couple of parties that are going to make some noise, that you talk to your neighbours in advance so that they don't tell your property manager, or they don't complain to the owner of the property if you are a tenant in that case. And what's number 7 before we get into some of these stories?
Number 7 is the impact that can have on your property. So, for example, if you've got large trees which overhang on your property and drop plums, feijoas onto the section, or there's overgrown foliage, which we're going to talk about in a minute, all these kind of things might result in a little bit of tension if you don't know the neighbours and you can't just go and have a friendly chat saying, saying, hey, would you mind chopping down that tree? And I've heard lots and lots of stories, particularly around trees. So people then, wait for the neighbours to go away, and then they go away, then they go and chop something down, and then all of a sudden there's a major dispute.
Well, actually, I think you've got a story about this, but just before you do, it's amazing the disputes that very, very nice and reasonable people can get into. Now, again, over the Easter break, and this will be a few weeks ago by the time this podcast is released, I went down to Taranaki and talked to my lovely mum. Now, I asked her, now, Ali, do you listen to the show? Do you listen to the Property Academy podcast? No, I don't. No, I don't. That's very sad. You really should be doing it. But the benefit of her not listening to the show, again, is that I can talk about her on here and she'll never know. And one of the most hilarious things is she's had a long-running dispute with her neighbour at the back of her section. And one of the things is she had a tree that was overhanging his section, and he chopped some parts down and he biffs them over onto her side of the section. Which my understanding is he's actually within his rights to do so.
So if it's hanging over his section, absolutely you can chop it down. I wouldn't think that you could go and throw the scraps back over, but if it's over your fence, you're allowed to trim to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Now, anyway, Ali goes out then and biffs him back over to his side of the fence.
Good on her.
Now, I'm sure I looked this up though, and I'm pretty sure that it is her responsibility to get rid of them in that case. Somebody's going to text in and correct me if I've got that completely wrong. But now, let me ask you, Andrew, what's your story around overgrowing foliage or foliage dispute?
Look, and actually, as I start to think about these stories, there's more and more that I've come across. I've got a good one. So a good friend of mine from school, his mum is the loveliest woman in the world. Her name's Lynn. I won't tell you her last name because Lynn will get embarrassed or ring me and tell me off. And Lynn, she is a salt of the earth woman. Anyway, Lynn lived in this house and she had a neighbour on the hill, and there was a fence which they wanted to kind of repair in a certain area. And so the neighbour came over and said, hey, look, we'd like to go halves on this fence repair. Lynn said, well, actually, on the hill, it's more common to kind of have a hedge. So why don't we just patch in the areas of the hedge so we have, equal privacy, but it's probably more suitable to the type of property. Anyway, the neighbour did not want this, and so they ended up in this dispute. And I remember this all going on. I mean, I must have been 15, 16 at the time, but there was lots of back and forth. Then Lynn's plants started dying, and Lynn has quite a green thumb and couldn't understand why her plants were dying in the backyard. And so what she did, or what my friend Tim did, is they installed a security system. And at 5 a.m, they managed to get this old Doris from next door creeping across in her slippers and her dressing gown and poisoning the plants. And she was just trying to irritate Lynn enough. And so it turned into like a serious thing. It ended up going to court over this because the neighbour wasn't satisfied with Lynn's recommendation of putting in bushes. So it was all quite funny. Well, sorry, I rang Lynn. This is like 15 years later. And Lynn said, yeah, it's funny now, but it is interesting. You can often have neighbours where you can be quite reasonable, but they're not.
It's interesting as well, Andrew, the number of disputes that happen around fences. And I guess the issue is that in this case, Lynn would be like, well, there's nothing wrong with what we've currently got in place. But the other neighbours got it into their head, whether rightly or wrongly, that they really, really want this fence and they want the other neighbour to pay half in it, because that's usually what would happen if you're repairing a fence or something is specifically damaged. Now, let me tell you a fence story of my own. Let's go back to that dispute with Ali and her neighbour, Don. So he had it in his head that the fence between them was structurally unsound, and he was very, very worried about this.
What gave him that idea?
I don't know. He got it into it. He got it into his head. Maybe he saw it swaying in the wind a little bit and decided that it was very, very concerning to him. And so he starts writing letters to her, and he starts knocking on her door and turning up. And my mum's not into this. Very private person, just doesn't want somebody else on her property. Totally understand that. You're totally allowed that. Anyway, this got very, very heated. Ended up going to the disputes tribunal.
Dispute tribunal. So that's a pretty serious step at that stage.
No. It did go there. And Ali sent a representative And then actually, this is quite funny. They ended up going over. They left the wherever the judgment was happening. I've never been to the disputes tribunal. Don't know where
Yet.
Yet it'll definitely happen at some point. And they went to the house and decided.
Hang on. The mediator,
mediator
got in their car and drove to the site to check the structural integrity of this fence.
Yeah, because they're a structural expert, of course.
Yeah, of course.
And anyway, in the end, Ellie had to pay, I think, 25% of the cost, and the neighbour paid 75% of it. But this was over a 2-year period of dispute, and it was the talk of the family Christmas luncheon
it was the
for
talk
years.
of Taranaki.
Well, it arguably still is. I like to get an update.
I believe the new banner is.
As much as we laugh about this now, it's important to recognise that these get very emotional.
Absolutely, because this is where people live, and so if you've got a rental property next to an owner-occupier and the tenants are causing an issue, it will bring quite a severe amount of stress. And actually, there was a situation that Linda, our head of our property management team, was telling me not so long ago, and it was purely because I'd had this phone call out of the blue, it was 5 missed calls in a couple of hours while I was in meetings, and I thought, this is odd. And so I ring this lady back, and she was not a client of ours. She was not a tenant of ours, and what had happened is she rented a house next door to some of our tenants, and they didn't get on. And as a result, they'd ended up having some serious barneys in the driveway, yelling at each other, like serious profanities. And the police had been called several times, and they both were as bad as each other. And she was threatening to take us to the tenancy tribunal for not acting severely enough against these tenants to evict them, which they'd done nothing which was able to be evicted on. We'd followed due process there, but she was so hot under the collar over it that police had been called at least 3 times.
Well, in that instance, would she have a claim at the tenancy tribunal or a disputes tribunal against Venture in this case?
No, because none of it was properly documented. So we had nothing to actually go back to the tenants for, because they've got a right to privacy themselves, and so we can't just say, look, we've had this hearsay that you've been causing all this grief, other than the police reports, which police had come out and basically said both sides need to act their age and stop annoying each other, but it had just got to such a severe state that it was kind of hard to go back from.
Interesting. Now, let's change track for a moment and talk about, how do we as property investors then get on with the neighbours, and so that we are able to get agreement when we need those first 7 things that we talked about? What are some of the things you've done in the past to try and make friends with neighbours so that you get on?
Well, don't be a pain in the butt would be probably the first tip. And I say that having upset my neighbours the other day by setting off a firework, which was a pretty dumb move after the Port Hills fire. And it was just one of those stupid things where some of the kids were around and we set off a firework, and next thing I had the neighbour run over. You don't want to do that. The things that you do is you go and introduce yourself to the neighbours, say, hey, look, we've moved in next door, we're renting next door, we've got a wee puppy, say, for example. If he ever bothers you, just let us know, send us a text, and we'll deal with it. Doing things like that and opening the lines of communication is probably a good start.
And certainly as a property investor, there are times where you might do that as you're purchasing a property and let them know that, hey, I've bought this, it's going to be a rental property. I'm going to be very thorough in terms of how I'm going to select these tenants. It's going to be professionally managed. Maybe you might let those people know the name of your property management firm if there ever was an issue. Of course, you don't want to open yourself up to complaints about everything under the sun, but most reasonable people, and that's what you're hoping to play into, you're hoping to bring out the reasonableness of these neighbours, will respect that. And if there is a real issue, then they can let the property manager know who is actually in contact with those tenants and can sort it out. And
actually, there was an article on the Property Investors Forum where a neighbour had picked up that a house that had been rented to someone was actually being used as an Airbnb and then essentially sublet. And so So all of a sudden, there were people coming and going all the time. There was going to be significant wear to the property compared to just a normal rental. And because the tenant was in breach of their lease agreement, they were able to be evicted, and the owner was able to find a more suitable tenant. So because of that communication, something like that wasn't going to be able to be picked up otherwise was identified.
Interesting. I saw another one on the Property Investors Chat group. This is a Facebook group that many property investors are involved with, which is always interesting, and because people put some of their neighbourly disputes down. And one was about a fence that was almost like my mother's, slightly leaning over.
Slightly ajar.
And the elderly neighbour decided that he wanted to get this fixed and he was going to pay for it. And he did, hired a handyman to come round. Look, the job is not what I would call beautiful or in keeping, and he's been somewhat cheeky in that the posts that have been installed in order to keep this fence upright, or it's been the fence has then been attached to these posts. It's not what I'd call the most elegant job. Now, what I'd probably say to this person, Vicky here, is at the end of the day, if it's a rental property, it probably doesn't matter. Like, it's not the prettiest thing in the world, but you've got to be somewhat emotionally uninvolved and say, look, it may not be the prettiest thing, but if you eventually come to sell the property, could you rectify it? Yes, you probably could. Is this going to be enough to make your tenants severely unhappy? No, it's probably not going to make them unhappy. It's not going to affect your rent. It's not going to affect your vacancy. At the end of the day, it might be a bit annoying, but maybe you just move on for the greater good and keeping your neighbours happy.
And actually, there was one more on there. Kane said, after advice.
You can't say the last name.
Oh, sorry, Kane. Hi, after a long-standing argument with the neighbour at one of our rentals regarding a tree on our property, it appears that the tree has been poisoned.
It's a common thing. Neighbours doing this.
It is a common thing. Would anyone have any information of whether or not this tree can be brought back to life? It can't be. And who would I contact about the alleged poisoning? Now, it depends how it's poisoned. So someone told me if you... Actually, no, I'm not going to tell everyone how to do this.
No, go on, tell us now.
Apparently, if you drill a hole and put salt water into the trunk, that kills it and leaves no trace.
Amazing.
No killing any trees, listeners.
Hey, look, fantastic. Let's wrap it up there. But please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really does help us get the message out to more people. And hey, if you want to learn more about property, we do have another webinar coming up. This is the 27th of April at 7 p.m. with our special guest, Ilse Wolf. We're going to be talking about how to cash flow hack your investment property portfolio through renovations so you can beat the government's tax changes. I'm going to drop a link to that in the show notes, so tap or swipe over the cover art. It'll be in there. Or just go to opuspartners.co.nz/webinar. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Ebert Knight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And we're going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.